Good morning. As you know, this week, inshallah, we are going to have a lab about dissection of the brain, and therefore I found it necessary and useful to record a video about the anatomy of the brain before Tuesday, because most probably we are going to have the lab on Tuesday, inshallah. I've been watching videos about dissection of the brain. Many of them are useful, but they are rather lengthy and they are rather complicated, including information that is not required for you in grade 11 or that are outside the scope of your curriculum. And therefore, I decided to make a rather concise video as much as I can about the detailed anatomy of the brain. You will be watching the video and then you will be, inshallah, answering questions that will be sent to you this afternoon. I'll start by sharing the screen on the presentation. I've added some pictures on the slides in order to be able to explain the anatomy of the heart on those pictures. Okay, we will work on the slideshow. Of course, as you know, the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain consists of two cerebral hemispheres. This looks rather like a normal brain. This is the superior surface of the brain, and actually it is the superior surface of the cerebrum, which is the main part of the brain, because actually the brain consists of those two halves that are called the two cerebral hemispheres, and that are separated together or that are separated from each other by this longitudinal fissure or sulcus. A fissure or a sulcus is a depression that divides the substance of the brain incompletely. So we have the right cerebral hemisphere, meaning the right half of the cerebrum, and the left cerebral hemisphere that are separated from each other by a longitudinal sulcus or fissure. If you look at the substance of the brain, or at the surface actually of the brain, you will find that the surface of the brain is made of elevated parts and depressed parts in between. The elevated parts look like hills, and the depressed parts look like valleys. Those elevated parts are called gyri. So the gyrus is the elevated portion, and the sulcus is the fissure in between two gyri. What's the importance of this indentation? What's the importance of that folding in the form of gyri and sulci? It is to increase the surface area of the brain. So if that brain is expanded or extended or stretched out to the maximum, you will find that it will have a much larger surface area. Of course, the more surface area is allowed, the more you have neurons and nerve cells. That's why those gyri and sulci are very prominent in human brains, because they are the most highly developed vertebrates. This is the superior surface of the cerebral hemispheres, and we can see the right cerebral hemisphere. Of course, I'm talking about the right side of the person, and the left cerebral hemisphere. If we look at the lateral aspect of the brain, and here we have a brain that, a real human brain that is preserved in formalin, which is essentially formaldehyde solution. It's a preservative, like the one ancient Egyptians preserved mummies or caused mummification of bodies, of human bodies after death in. You will find this in your pathology department in the School of Medicine. Brain is made of organic material, and if you leave it in the outside air without a preservative, it would undergo like putrefaction, and bacteria would act on it and dissolve it and give a foul smell. Through this glass jar and through formalin, we can see here the left cerebral hemisphere. We can see a part of the sulcus and the right cerebral hemisphere. And we can also see this structure that looks like a butterfly. Okay, so we have in the middle, we have something called the vernix, and then we have the one half here and another half here. This is the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum, now because of the great importance of the cerebellum in preserving equilibrium of the body and in helping balance during walking, during standing up, during performing voluntary movements, and because of its importance in coordination, as we will see, of fine motor structures like playing the piano or typewriting, the cerebellum is now considered a separate entity of the brain. In this diagram, we see only, or in this specimen, actually, it's a true human brain. We can see only the cerebrum with the two cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum. So you have left cerebral hemisphere, right cerebral hemisphere, and in between we have the main body or the vernix of the cerebellum. In this lateral view, again, you can see the left cerebral hemisphere and the cerebellum, and you can just see the uppermost part of the spinal cord or the lowermost part of the medulla oblongata. Here in this lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, we can see another deep sulcus. We have two deep sulci that are shown here. We have the longitudinal sulcus or fissure that separates the right and left cerebral hemispheres. And here we have this lateral sulcus. Lateral because it is present on the lateral surface of the body, and it separates the frontal lobe above, the anterior lobe, the frontal lobe above, from the temporal lobe below. Temporal because it lies just under the temples. These are your temples. Now, if we look at the inferior surface of the brain or the ventral surface of the brain, we can still see the two cerebral hemispheres and the two cerebellar hemispheres, but now we can see more structures. So we can see the spinal cord, we can see the medulla oblongata, and we can see the pons. Here, deeper, we can see the midbrain, meaning that you can look or you can watch or see the brainstem when you look at the inferior surface of the brain, okay? Now, what about the lobes of the brain? Actually, we have here a sulcus, which is the lateral sulcus. Here we supposedly have the longitudinal sulcus, which is this one, but we don't see it in the lateral view. So here we have the lobe in front that is called the frontal lobe, and then we have the temporal lobe. And then just behind, here we have another sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is present here. And then finally, we have another sulcus that we don't see clearly on this diagram that separates the occipital lobe at the back from the parietal lobe. So we have the frontal lobe, we have the parietal. Parietal means near the wall. So we have the frontal lobe, which is at the front of the brain, and then we have the parietal lobe, which is at the lateral aspect, and then we have the temporal lobe under the temples, and then we have the occipital lobe. These are the four visible lobes on the lateral surface of the cerebral hemispheres. Here we can see part of the cerebellum, and as we have said, the cerebellum is a separate entity of the brain. Now, if we look here, this is a coronal section in the brain, and we can see the right cerebral hemisphere, the left cerebral hemisphere, and here this transverse structure that is colored green. Of course, it's not green in nature. This is just a diagram. It's called the corpus callosum, and you will find its name on the diagrams on the presentation. Corpus callosum, C-A-L-L-O-S-U-M, corpus callosum. Corpus means body. The corpus callosum is made of transverse parallel fibers that are highly myelinated or thickly myelinated. And of course, you know that myelination of the nerve fibers enhances and increases the speed of transmission of electric impulses. So mainly, the main function of the corpus callosum is to connect the right and left cerebral hemispheres, meaning that if a certain type of sensation, like visual sensation, if I see somebody, for example, so I will receive a picture of that body on in my occipital lobe that contains the vision center, and another picture of the same body in the occipital lobe to the left. Therefore, I'm receiving two pictures. If the corpus callosum is not there to make this fast coordination between the two cerebral hemispheres, you can see two different images, or you do not see the two images at the same time. So one of the major defects that occur when the corpus callosum is injured is what we call the déjà vu phenomenon. And of course, we've talked about déjà vu phenomenon in case of epilepsy, but other than epilepsy, if there is an injury to the corpus callosum, one of its manifestations is the déjà vu phenomenon, because you receive one of the two pictures for the same thing a fraction of a second before the other, so you have the feeling that you have seen it before. In this diagram, we use a retractor in order to remove the part of the frontal lobe, part of the parietal lobe, and another retractor to lower down the temporal lobe. And you can see that greenish area. Actually, it's not green. Again, it's colored green in order to highlight that area, which is called the insula. It's written like insulin, but at the end there is an A. Actually, the insula is mainly made of gray matter, not white matter, and it seems as if it were on a level that is lower, or actually it doesn't seem. It is at a lower level than the rest of the brain. It is deeper, and it contains important centers. For example, it contains part of the taste or gustatory center. It's written on the slides, Gustatory. The gustatory center is partly here in the insula and partly in the lower gyrus of the frontal lobe. It also is important for autonomic control, meaning that it is connected to sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve fibers to control autonomic and visceral functions, meaning that of the internal organs. The insula has rather recently been discovered, and therefore it is a bit, the nature and the function of the insula are controversial. Some scientists consider it a fifth lobe. We have the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, we have the occipital lobe, we have the temporal lobe, and the fifth one is the insula, whereas others consider it just gray matter. Here, it's a good opportunity to see that the substance of the brain is made of an outer cortex that looks in nature gray, and an inner, so we have an outer cortex and an inner white matter, which represents the main substance of the brain. The outer gray cortex is mainly made of the cell bodies of the axons and of the unmyelinated parts of the axons, whereas the white matter is made of bundles of myelinated axons, because you know that the myelin sheath is lipid in nature, and that the myelin sheath gives a white shiny color to the nerves and facilitates transmission. This outer gray cortex, because it contains the cell bodies of the neurons, will contain the higher centers where all the data that have been collected will be gathered and integrated together in order to come up with a decision. So they are considered higher centers of the brain. Of course, because of the multiple gyri and sulci that we have in our brain, we have a huge area for the gray cortex, and therefore we can carry out more complicated processes. In this diagram, you can also see the lobes of the brain. So you can see the frontal lobe, including this dark pink area. You can see the parietal lobe, including the dark purple and light purple areas. You can see the occipital lobe, and then the temporal lobe, and then the cerebellum, and then the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord. You can also see the central sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and you can see the lateral sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe. Here, this occipital lobe is separated from the parietal lobe by a sulcus that's not as deep as the previous two sulci. It's called parieto-occipital sulcus. And in between the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, we have another sulcus that is called occipito-temporal sulcus. Now, if we take a section, or if we dwell deep into the central sulcus, the longitudinal central sulcus that separates the brain into two cerebral hemispheres, and if we use a bread knife, a long and deep knife in order to cut deep into the substance of the brain, we can see that colored portion of the brain. Here you can see the corpus callosum. This is a section, of course, the corpus callosum that connects the two cerebral hemispheres together. This green area above the corpus callosum is one of the gyri of the brain. It's called the cingulate gyrus. And then here, this purple part is called the hippocampus. And then the yellow part is the thalamus, which is considered the secretary of the brain that relays and filters all sensory data that are reaching the brain, and that also relays motor orders descending from the brain to the various parts of the human body. Meaning that, for example, if there is sensory information coming from the eye that I am going to fall down, then the cerebellum will take action. The internal ear will send impulses that the fluid inside my ears has been moved. All these sensory data pass through the thalamus. The thalamus sends them to the corresponding important areas of the brain. So it sends them to the sensory area in the parietal lobe. And then when motor orders arise from the motor center of the brain, these descending electric motor impulses will reach the thalamus first, and then through the different tracts and descending neurons that arise from the thalamus, they will be distributed to different areas. So it looks like a train station or a relay station where impulses can come from one place and then change direction and go to another place, whether these impulses are descending or ascending. Here in the center, we have like a cavity, and that cavity is called the ventricle. There are 4 ventricles in the brain, but a ventricle is a space in the brain where fluid is present, because you know that the brain is surrounded and the spinal cord are surrounded by protective fluid that is called the cerebrospinal fluid. But that fluid is not only around the brain and the spinal cord to protect them, but it's also partly inside the substance of the brain. And here we have the amygdala. And the amygdala, طبعا كل limbic system is important for our subconscious and emotional parts, meaning that here you have the reward system, meaning that when you do something good, you feel satisfied, you feel happy. When somebody appreciates you, you feel happy. the amygdala here, or the amygdaloid body, is very important to control aggressiveness and rudeness. So they've done or they've carried out experiments on animals. And when they removed the amygdala, the animal was very aggressive, was cruel, and the responses were very rude and dangerous. Concerning the hypothalamus, here you have the thalamus, the secretary of the nervous system, and here you have the hypothalamus underneath, and it is connected to the pituitary gland. And here, of course, you have the pineal body, but we are not going to discuss the detailed function of these structures. But what's most important and interesting is the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus, first, it is connected to the pituitary gland. And if one day you study the endocrine system, you will know that the hypothalamus is connected to the anterior pituitary and to the posterior pituitary. And therefore, it helps, or it shares in helping the pituitary gland form the secretion or release the secretion. Meaning that for the anterior pituitary hormones that are formed in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus sends releasing factors or inhibiting factors, but it doesn't share in making the secretion. So if it sends releasing factors to the anterior pituitary gland, then the anterior pituitary gland will secrete its hormones, like a follicle stimulating hormone, for example, or luteinizing hormone. And conversely, if it sends inhibitory impulses, then these secretions will be inhibited. But for the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the secretions are essentially made in the hypothalamus. And if we say that oxytocin hormone and antidiuretic hormone are released from the posterior pituitary, you have to be very accurate because, or precise, saying that they are released. Essentially, they are made as a neurosecretion from the nerve endings of the hypothalamus, but they are released from the posterior pituitary that is connected to the neurons of the hypothalamus. Now we come to the functional areas of the brain. Here we are going to look at the anatomy of the heart of the brain, and we're going to correlate it to the function of the brain. For example, this number one part of the frontal lobe is responsible for higher mental functions like analysis, for example, like integration of data, drawing conclusions, logical sequences, making decisions. These are the higher mental functions. And then number three is the primary motor area. Primary motor area is the center where the cell bodies of motor neurons are present to give or to initiate or to facilitate or even to inhibit motor functions, voluntary motor functions. And we discussed this in hemiplegia when we were discussing hemiplegia. Number two is also responsible for voluntary motor actions, but voluntary motor actions that are more or less related to training. So it is well developed in monkeys. That's why monkeys can imitate, because if they see something that is repeatedly seen or repeatedly done in front of them, they can imitate it. So it's rather responsible for a specific type of voluntary movement. But number three, although it looks smaller, yet it is more important, because number three here, or the motor area on the frontal lobe, in the frontal lobe to the right side, is responsible for voluntary motor action of the other half of the body. Here we have the central sulcus, and behind it, we have the primary sensory area that is related to detecting sensations, contralateral sensations, meaning sensations on the opposite side of the body. And therefore, if area 4 is injured, then you will have hemianesthesia meaning weakness of sensation or complete loss of sensation on the opposite side of the body. Okay, so number 4 and number 5 are essentially sensory areas, but number 5, as you see in the labeling here, is an association area, a sensory association area. What's the difference? I think we discussed this when we were talking about the sensory receptors in the skin, meaning that if area number 4 receives a pinprick, for example, you will feel the pain of the pinprick. In order to understand that what you felt is a pinprick, this is what we call association. So the association area is this is what we call perception. So perception is understanding the sensation, and it is the association area that is responsible for understanding the sensation. In the temporal lobe, this yellow area is called the auditory area, meaning that all the impulses that come from the sensory impulses that come from the auditory nerve, which is a cranial nerve number 8, that arises from the internal ear, will reach here, the auditory area, to stimulate the nerve cells. But in order for you to understand the sound, the nature of this and the origin of the sound you hear, there should be close to the auditory area, there should be an auditory association area. Here, number 7 is a very peculiar area that is called vernix area. It is present in the parietal lobe, and it is considered the sensory center for speech. What do we mean by sensory center for speech? In order for me to formulate a certain sentence or a certain paragraph, I must first think about the idea, develop the idea, and then I have to use the articulators like the lip muscles, like the cheek muscles, the tongue muscles, the throat and laryngeal muscles in order to pronounce the words that will express my ideas. Vernix area is responsible for the ideas of speech, and therefore if vernix area is injured, like, can it be injured? Yes. For example, accidental trauma, or even hypertension, hypertensive crisis, a stroke that damages cells of vernix area, then you can read what's written, but you cannot formulate speech. So you have difficulty in speech synthesis. Number 10 is Broca's area, and number 10 is present in the frontal lobe, and this is the motor area for speech, meaning that if Broca's area is injured, then you can formulate speech, you can formulate ideas, you can synthesize speech, but you will have difficulty pronouncing it. And it's not only in the articulators of the face, but also in handwriting, the muscles for writing. This is what we mean by the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. Why do we say functional areas of the cerebral cortex and not of the brain? And actually, it is the cerebral cortex that contains the nuclei and the cell bodies of the axons or the tali that is smarter and that is related to the function. Okay, here again, we have the parts of the human brain. You have the frontal lobe with Broca's area, and then at the most posterior part of the frontal lobe and just anterior to the central, to the, to this sulcus, we have the motor area, and then behind it, we have the sensory area in the parietal lobe. So actually the motor, the voluntary motor area lies in the frontal lobe, whereas the sensory somatic area together with the association area lies in the parietal lobe. Here we have vernix area. It's at the most posterior part of the temporal lobe. By the way, we have other centers related to the frontal and temporal lobes. I'll be saying them now on the diagram. For example, in the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, we have the olfactory center, because here you have the nose and there are nerve fibers that arise, that reach a swelling here called olfactory bulb. The axons reach the olfactory bulb, and then they continue to reach their terminal endings end here in the olfactory area. So if that olfactory area is damaged, then you might lose smell. In the temporal lobe, you have the auditory area. So in the upper part of the temporal lobe, you have the hearing center, and just next to it, you have the association, auditory association area, meaning that the auditory center helps you just hear. But in order for you to understand what you hear, in order for you to perceive, perception, what you hear, you need an association area. طب we talked about olfaction or smelling, we talked about hearing, the auditory and auditory association areas. Type, what about taste? Actually, taste is present in the insula. If we go back to the insula here, the taste center is partly present in the insula and partly present in the lowermost part of the frontal lobe. And next to the gustatory or taste center, you have the gustatory association center, meaning that you taste through receiving impulses in the gustatory center, and then you understand or perceive the nature of what you taste in this center in the insula, which is the gustatory association area. Okay. Concerning the last lobe, which is the occipital lobe, it contains the vision center, and the vision center and the vision association center, meaning that you have the center that helps you see, and then you have the center that helps you understand what you see. Okay. The last thing I would like to talk about, and I almost covered the main functions of the brain, but I need to talk a bit about the frontal lobe and about the brain stem and the cerebellum, but very rapidly. Concerning the frontal lobe, we talked about higher intellectual functions like logical sequencing, making decisions, but also the frontal lobe is responsible for behavior, meaning that anything that is repetitive, anything that is considered habitual, like for example, making a cup of coffee or making a cup of Nescafe, this memory of the habits is in the frontal lobe. So if you have a tumor, if you have a tumor in the frontal lobe, you might have disturbed the habitual memory or habit memory, meaning that you might go to the kitchen and you have your Nescafe, your coffee mate in front of you, or your coffee and sugar and the mug, and you stand like this still, you don't know what to do. You don't remember how to make a cup of coffee or a cup of Nescafe. Not only because the centers of memory are greatly present in the frontal lobe, but also because the memory of habits of your daily routine and your daily habits are present in the frontal lobe. Okay. This is concerning the frontal lobe. Concerning the cerebellum. The cerebellum, as I said, is responsible for equilibrium, meaning that in order for you to stand upright like this, there should be a balance between the anti-gravity muscles that are at the back and that make you stand erect like this, and the anterior muscles. If the anti-gravity muscles were not there and were not functioning properly, then you would lean forward by gravity, because the center of gravity or the center of your weight, because of your head that is extending anterior to the plane of your body, would make you fall downward by the weight of your head. So every time you tend to lean forward, and this is what happens to young infants when they are learning how to walk. The cerebellum sends impulses in order to stimulate the anti-gravity muscles. So it is responsible for equilibrium. How does the cerebellum know? It receives impulses from the muscles, which we called before proprioceptive sensations. deep receptors in the muscles, in the tendons of muscles, in the ligaments of joints, in the capsules around joints. All these deep structures give are connected to the cerebellum, from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. Ascending spinocerebellar sensory fibers give information to the cerebellum about the position of your body, and the cerebellum gives motor orders to adjust your position. That's why if a person has a cerebellar disease, there will be what we call ataxia, meaning that there will be like a drunken gait or a zigzag gait. If you ask your patient, hatta without asking the patient, yani as he is coming towards you in the clinic, you will find that he has a gait that looks like the gait of drunken people. Furthermore, he has stuttered speech, meaning that we call it staccato speech, meaning that the speech is interrupted because the cerebellum is responsible for coordination. As I told you before, in order to typewrite, for example, to write on the keyboard or to play the piano, your fingers are all the time, the fine, small muscles in your fingers are all the time contracting and relaxing. So if I do this, so those muscles are contracting. If I do like this, then those muscles are contracting. So if you do this very rapidly, then there should be very rapid alternation between contraction and relaxation. If that muscle contracts to flex the joint, then the opposite muscle, the antagonistic muscle, has to relax to allow the joint to flex. Otherwise, it would become extended. And if both muscles work at the same time, the finger wouldn't function. So in order for very rapid fine movements, you need very rapid coordination, meaning that when you send impulses to a muscle to contract, you have to send impulses to the antagonistic muscle to relax. And this happens all the time. That's why when people have their cerebellum affected, the commonest thing is that they lose that coordination. The first early symptoms is that they cannot typewrite, they cannot play the piano. If they used to do, they cannot do or undo their buttons. And all these, they cannot talk smoothly, fluently, because taban talking requires coordination between several muscles at the same time, like the lip muscles, the tongue muscles, the pharyngeal muscles, the facial muscles, and the laryngeal muscles. Last thing to talk about is the brainstem. The medulla contains all these centers: center for breathing, heart rate, digestion, sneezing, coughing. So all these reflexes like sneezing, coughing, vomiting, and swallowing have their centers in the medulla oblongata, not only breathing. And that's why when a person has a brain stroke that affects the brain, the brainstem, but without being fatal, yani without affecting the breathing center and the heart rate center, they might have difficulty swallowing, for example. Yani they don't have this coordination of swallowing, so they might have nasal regurgitation, for example, because of absence of this reflex. They cannot swallow. Swallowing is a reflex. If food touches the back of the pharynx or the back of the tongue, there is reflex peristalsis down the esophagus and the upper part, the lower part of the pharyngeal muscles. But if the center for this, which is in the medulla, is not working fine, then swallowing would be impossible, and those people have difficulty swallowing. What about the pons? The pons contains other centers. Some of them are responsible for moving the eyes, but others are responsible for, it contains actually two, it's not on the presentation, but it's interesting to know. It contains two opposite centers, one that stops inspiration and one that excites inspiration, meaning that if you take a deep breath, there is a certain limit that you cannot exceed. You're being stopped by that center in the pons. On the other hand, in order to reinitiate a new inspiration, you have another antagonistic center in the pons. You're not supposed to know this. It's just to know that the pons shares the medulla oblongata in controlling breathing. Thank you, guys. I'll be specifying the slides I've explained. I'll be uploading the pictures or a new version of the PowerPoint presentation, and I'll be sending a lab sheet, and you have to finish that sheet before Tuesday in order to be ready for the dissection lab. Thank you so much for your patience, and see you inshallah on Tuesday. Bye.